What is the best vehicle to tow a 2.5-ton caravan? Ultimate answer, none of them. Just visit the Hyatt, you goose. Caravanning really is, to me, just a means to holiday in hell before death for people disengaged with objective reality. It's probably not all that helpful, so a longer answer involving the relative assessment of a few different vehicles and some basic engineering criteria is next. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, and I get new cars cheap. Australia only. Website. Card. Would you please be upstanding and join me in celebrating the National Caravanning Anthem? Living easy, loving free. Season ticket on a one-way ride. Asking nothing, leave me be. Taking everything in my stride. Don't need reason, don't need rhyme. Ain't nothing that I'd rather do. Going down, party time. My friends are gonna be there too. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. The internet is so useful, of course, but also a bit risky. You use it every day, so you've got to protect yourself from cyber criminals, scammers, and hackers. NordVPN is a great way to do that. It's simple and effective. You just subscribe, you download the app, and you connect. One click later, you are better protected. Your IP address is shielded from scammers, and your online traffic is masked with state-of-the-art encryption across as many as 6 devices. That's especially useful if you don't want anyone else, including your ISP, your employer, or even the government, looking over your shoulder while you're online. You don't want your employer watching you applying for a job at a competitor, for example. That could get awkward. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC right now and you'll get a huge discount plus up to 4 additional months free and a 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/AEJC. I'll put a link in the description. NordVPN is the fastest VPN on Earth, and it costs only about as much as a cup of coffee every month to keep your data, your identity, and your devices secure. Because your location is masked, you'll be able to access streaming and other services that might be geo-blocked where you live, plus you can continue to watch your favourite content when you travel overseas. All up, it's a pretty small price to pay for enhanced cybersecurity and greater access to this and that online. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now to get more secure and enjoy a juicy discount plus those extra months of free subscription time. It's totally risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/AEJC, link in the description, and thanks to Nord for sponsoring this episode. Here's an unsolicited question I got the other day by email from a dude named Pete, who says, "Firstly, thank you for all your videos." Welcome, Pete. "I love every one of them. All of them are very entertaining and at the same time very informative." Trowel it on, dude. I'm already answering your frickin' question. This is just undignified. "I have one question, please, because it can be quite confusing. This question for me." That's a little bit Pirates of Penzance, isn't it? Very model of the modern Major General stuff, the way you phrased that. 13 points out of a possible 10. Pete of Penzance. "What would be the best car to go around Australia towing the below van? We are not planning to go off-road." Well, thank Christ for small mercies, Pete of Penzance. The van, according to PP, is Jayco Starcraft 18.55-3 Touring. Nice choice of acoustically transparent aluminium chitoir, PP. So it's got an ATM, like an aggregate trailer mass, in other words, fully loaded weight, of 2.5 tonnes, 2,477 if you want to be a pedant about this stuff, and a MT ball mass, which just means tow ball download, 188 kilos. And I would suggest that this is just a beautiful $78,000 effluent toting, elegant box on wheels. Porter Hovel. Now, one of the things about the Jayco Starcraft 18.55-3 Touring is I really like the way they've made an allowance of additional space next to the crapper for an optional 3 kilogram top-loading washing machine. That's a nice touch, dude. It allows you, hypothetically, to ablute while at the same time dumping a load in the washing machine. And if you choose, you can just delicately pull the vinyl curtain to one side, separating the crapper from the kitchen. And you could reach around into the refrigerator and perhaps beat up a dozen eggs with some bacon and olives for a cheeky frittata over lunch. And at the same time, continue the dialogue with your closest friends in the club lounge, which is also the marital bed on that highway to hell. And when you look at it, really, caravanning is all about the efficiency. It's a little bit sort of confronting conceptually up front, but when you finally just push all that to one side and embrace it, how efficient is that? How inclusive. I love it. Peter goes on and says, would a Triton or Pajero Sport or Isuzu D-Max do the job, or did I need something more powerful? Would a Prado do the trick? Appreciate your honest and valued opinion. I suspect we're not going to be on speaking terms. I suspect we're not on speaking terms any longer, Peter Penzance. But Isuzu D-Max, like, Isuzu is so emphatically crap at customer care that I just can't, in good faith, recommend one to you. And yeah, it'd probably do the job, but it'd kind of be okay. And I'd also suggest that it's not really about the power. A lot of people get this wrong. It's not about powertrain performance primarily. It's primarily about stability, okay? Like, that's the number one consideration when you're choosing a vehicle on a budget to tow a dirty, big, heavy caravan with a top loader next to the crapper and a vinyl curtain. Like, some people think the vinyl curtain was an example of Jayco just cheaping out. But I say, au contraire, because you'd want it open most of the time anyway, and the concertina, like a way cover on a milling machine, it's very space efficient. So there's that. It's mainly about the stability, right? Because you can imagine, I'll just find an appropriate prop somewhere. You can imagine that your caravan is like a box like this, and it's got axles in the centre. And I say this all the time. It pivots around the axles, and that means it's dynamically fairly unstable in pitch, and it's also fairly unstable in yaw, but it's okay in roll because the wheels at least are laterally outboard, right? So it's got pretty good roll stability, a rotation about the roll axis, but it's fairly crap at pitch and yaw, and that means these inertial loads caused by moving in the planes of pitch and yaw are transmitted to the vehicle. And if the vehicle is relatively massive in comparison with the caravan, it does a good job at absorbing these forces that might otherwise cause the whole thing to come unglued. But the bigger the caravan in relation to the vehicle towing it, the more of an effect these inertial loads, the pitching loads and the yawing loads, like yawing is just rotating like this, like an LP record, okay, about a central pivot, and pitching is just that head forward and back up and down thing, like under brakes and on the gas, like getting in a taxi, okay? That's the best example of pitching that I can imagine. Why do taxi drivers just drive as if the accelerator is an on-off switch? I don't know. Anyway, there's that to consider. So stability is kind of a big deal. And the reason I would not recommend Triton for this is that when you have a close look at the Triton and you look at the location of the tow ball in space and you look at the location of the rear axle in space, it's a long way from the center line of the rear axle to the center line of the tow ball. And that means that that particular length is like a lever. So anytime the caravan gets on the back end here and starts exerting its various pitching and yawing influences on the tow ball, it then acts on the rear axle via a comparatively long lever, and therefore the effect on the rear axle and stability as a consequence is greater than it would be with other vehicles. And I own a Triton, okay? So I did not buy it for its ultimate heavy towing capacity. In fact, the heaviest thing I've ever towed with that vehicle was nudging 2 tons. It was a dirty, big, heavy, old cast iron fly press weighing about 1.5, and the trailer itself weighs 400, so total mass behind the Triton was 1.9-ish, maybe a little bit more than 1.9, but not exceeding the ATM of 2 tons, right? So I towed that about 130, 140 Ks in total, including a big stint on the freeway, and I'd have to suggest that in places where the freeway had been badly damaged by the recent rains, and it was quite uneven, that was not a pleasant experience, and I was down to 90 Ks an hour. It was controllable, but there was a lot of feedback between the trailer and the vehicle, and you could really feel it being nudged around. So I did the prudent thing and slowed down. But I would not want to tow more than 2 tons with my Triton, and you have to appreciate also that an 8x5 box trailer with a concentrated load in the centre of it is probably the best way to tow something heavy compared with a big boat or a caravan, because when it comes to inertial loads in rotation, the distribution and size of the load actually matters in the way that it doesn't in a straight line. Like inertia in a straight line, pushing and pulling on the van, it's just the mass. That's the only thing that matters. But when it comes to angular effects like rotation, the distribution of the masses really matters, and the more distributed they are away from the axles, the more the rotational effects are going to be. The easiest way to conceptualize this, the moment of inertia kind of effect, is if you imagine an egg crate with just 4 eggs in it, right? And you put your finger in the center of the egg crate like that, and it's nice and balanced, and you put the 4 eggs right there in the 4 most central location for the eggs, and then you spin it this way, or you pitch it up and down. It's easy to get moving and it's easy to stop because the load is not very distributed. It's pretty close to the pivot. If you take the eggs and you put them in the most outboard positions and you do the same experiment, it's much harder to get it moving and it's much harder to stop it once it is moving. And that's in pitch and in yaw. And this is the difference between having a concentrated load in a small trailer and a big, widely distributed load like in a caravan. It's maybe a little bit harder to get it moving, but when it starts to moving, it's freaking hard to stop. And if a heavy van with a widely distributed load starts getting out of control, it overwhelms the inertial restraint capability of the vehicle towing it. And I'd suggest that for loads more than about 1,500 kilos, certainly maxing out at 2 tons, I would really not be comfortable with the Triton over the 2-ton mark, and that's in a tightly distributed load, like all together over the axle, as opposed to widely distributed, right? And I guess some other utes with better geometry there, like less space between the rear axle centerline and the centerline of the tow ball, they're going to be inherently more stable because it's a smaller lever. And you might be able to extend that envelope to 2.2. And if you're really good at towing and quite conservative and you're a good driver, then maybe 2.5, okay? Maybe. But I'd suggest that 2.5 is right on the ragged edge for a ute in that 4x4 Australia-wide towing thing. And I'd also suggest that there's a huge difference between going from home to the nearest boat ramp with a 2.5 ton load. There's a huge difference between that and going around Australia, because Australia is 4,000 Ks that way and 4,000 Ks that way. And if you're doing a lap with a bit of crisscrossing, you're going to drive more than 20,000 kilometres in that configuration. And if you get the death wobbles once every 100 Ks, that's going to be 200 gold-plated opportunities to come off the road at speed during the course of your travel. And you really don't want that, okay? So ideally, Land Cruiser. for 2.5 tonnes. That would be my default answer. Now, when we're talking about Pajero Sport and Prado, which were the other suggested options from Peter Penzance there, the gross combination mass for the Pajero Sport is not going to be a problem because it's 5.7 or 5.8 tonnes, and you're not going to be anywhere near that, okay? So that's fine, but the gross vehicle mass is going to be a problem. When you look at Pajero Sport, the payload capacity is 665 kilos. That's the difference between the gross vehicle mass and the curb weight. The curb weight is the vehicle with a tank of fuel and nothing else. All the fluids, in other words, right? But not you, not your lovely wife, not your 3 brats, and not all the accessories that you bolted onto the car, not the tow ball download, which the vehicle is also carrying. So, although Peter Penzance did say that the tow ball download was like 180 kilos, the gross vehicle mass, like the aggregate trailer mass of his trailer, is about 2.5 tonnes. So I'd really want to see that trailer on a weighbridge, fully loaded, in its most heavily loaded configuration for touring, and I'd want to measure the tow ball download like that, because I'd suggest it would probably be closer to 250 kilos when the van is at 2.5 tonnes. That's 10%, right? And I'd further suggest that less than 10% is probably going to have overall stability kind of implications for touring, because you really want that 10% on the tow ball to keep the whole combination preloaded and fairly stable as you drive along conservatively. So if you go down to 180, you're coming off about 30%, let's say, and that's going to have stability implications probably. It's all going to be dependent on the distribution of the loads and what's in the vehicle and what speed you drive at and what kind of roads you drive on. But if you're going to tour Australia, some of those roads are going to be dirt roads and they're going to be emphatically shit. So you need to get all of this together, this whole bunch of variables, and figure out the right way to approach this. And if you've got 665 kilos of payload capacity in your Pajero Sport and you take 250 off for the tow ball, that leaves you with about 400 kilos of remaining load capacity. That's you and every other person in the vehicle, the stuff that they carry. And when you tour the Outback, you'd probably want to have 20 litres of water inside the vehicle at every time when you're driving, because water is the thing, or the absence of water is the thing that's going to kill you quickly if you break down. And the danger with putting it all in the caravan is you decouple and you just go for a little drive down there for 20 k's and it's a 40-degree day and the vehicle breaks down and you haven't got any water. And that kind of sucks. It's a life-threatening problem. You'd want your sat phone in the vehicle, obviously. You'd want maybe some spare fuel, maybe. And you definitely want a first aid kit, a fire extinguisher, your second spare tyre, some basic tools, recovery kit. You've probably put a bull bar. You've certainly put a tow bar on. It's an accessory too. You've probably got a roof rack with an awning. And once you add all that stuff up, it's hard to fit it all into 400 kilos once you take away the tow ball download. As for will Prado do any better, I'd suggest probably not. Probably not, because contrary to the popular perception of Prado being a more hardcore vehicle than a Pajero Sport, its payload capacity is substantially less. It's like 10% less. 665 kilos for Pajero Sport, 605 for Prado. And this is the limiting factor. So you've just knocked 60 kegs off the most constrained feature of the vehicle that's going to be doing the towing. It's harder to fit all of that crap into 605 kilos is kind of what I'm saying. And yeah, Prado is more powerful, but it also is about 170 something kilos heavier, and that means the power to weight difference, which is important for towing, but it's not as important as stability. You want the powertrain to perform okay because you don't want it to feel like really wringing its neck every time there's a hill about that steep, right? You want the powertrain to cope with the load. And there is more power, but the difference I calculated it actually, the power to weight difference is only 4% Prado is slightly better, but it's only 4% once you factor in the weight, in addition to the extra power available from the Prado's 2.8. But when you just look at the geometry, the wheelbase of a Prado and the wheelbase of a Pajero Sport are basically the same. So stability-wise, it's probably going to be very similar. Now, the other thing I think I really should mention to you is, if it was me on a budget, as opposed to with cash to burn, I know you've already dropped like $78,000 on your effluent tank out the back. So if you haven't got money to burn on the actual towing platform, then a Ranger V6, like the entry-level Ranger V6, is probably going to be good, because it'll overcome the geometry problem with Triton, where you've got a long distance from the rear axle to the tow ball, much more compact in the Ranger. It's got grunt to burn, and it's slightly heavier as well, so it'll be slightly more stable, because the proportion of the mass of your van to the mass of your ute is going to be better for stability, and you definitely do want that. Of course, the problems with the ownership of a Ford, although they've got a big dealer network, is that reliability is generally poor and customer service is generally fairly crap. And by that, I mean, you get thrown under the bus more often than you would with Mitsubishi, for example, or Hyundai or Kia or something of that nature. Now, Toyota is definitely better at reliability, but if you want to upgrade the tow platform, you really have to step up to a Land Cruiser 300, and that is hideously expensive, involves generally a pretty long wait, and the jury is out on the longevity of that hot V6 engine that comes standard in the Land Cruiser. Toyota's already admitted that it drinks more lubricating oil than many people are comfortable with, and they're engaged in a PR and expectation management campaign at the moment with existing owners, and only time's going to tell if that turns into a real problem down the track for them. And it's so freaking expensive anyway, so there's that to consider. And the best option really is going to be the Land Cruiser, I think, and the resale value with Land Cruiser is great. But if you're on a budget, I would have to go a long way to go past the V6 Ranger for that. And of course, if you haven't bought the van yet, why don't you just limit yourself to some kind of conveyance that is 2 tons, in which case the breadth of available vehicles and the likelihood of a really terminal instability event is much less, and you don't really need a 2.5 ton van to enjoy a bit of touring. I mean, there is an arms race at the moment, and obviously the Hellfire missile of the arms race is a 3.5 ton van, which is hideously impractical if you're trying to comply with GVM and gross combination mass limits elsewhere. But I guess the top of the mountain of desirability is a 3.5 ton van. I think that's crazy with conventional passenger type 4x4s. 2.5 tons is absolutely the upper limit of anything I would tow, and then you've got to be really careful about how you do it, dude. So if we're on speaking terms after this, P of Penzance, happy days. If not, dude, I hope this has helped, and please don't write to me and tell me what your caravanning holiday was like, because I've already got a pretty clear picture of that in my head.